Good afternoon, everyone. Today I'll be presenting on something that seems to be under-discussed in the policy world, which are ethnic-centric apps. These are apps that are used primarily by people of one ethnic group in Canada. My research question is an exploratory one. I'm trying to gauge what we know or don't know about these apps in the Canadian context, and if or how these apps should be considered for regulation. The two icons that you see on the screen right now are KakaoTalk in yellow and WeChat in green, the two apps that I focused my research on. My work is situated in the context of fast-growing digital diasporas around the world. Just to make sure we're all on the same page, diaspora refers to migrant groups who left their homeland but still identifies to an extent with that homeland. Digital diasporas, then, are migrant groups who use information and communication technology to participate in the online communities. These online communities could consist of people they know back home, people of the same ethnicity in their new country, as well as new connections they make in this new country. Now, why are digital diasporas important? These online spaces are safe havens, a networking space, and a bridge for migrants to connect with their homeland. So the digital spheres can be an important part of a migrant's livelihood as they learn, adapt, and live in a new environment. And as I prefaced earlier, I'll be talking about WeChat and Kakao. WeChat is used by Chinese Canadians, while Kakao is used by Korean Canadians. And according to StatsCan, the two cities with the highest density of these groups are Vancouver and Toronto. So these two ethnic-centric apps are likely the most relevant in these two cities. Now, there are many ethnic-centric apps, but I'll just discuss the two that I looked at. WeChat is a super app in China. The app in total has 1.2 billion users worldwide. WeChat is actually the most used messaging app in Asia. And aside from messaging friends, you could use the app to shop, to send money to friends, call a taxi, book a flight, look at maps, etc. There are also official accounts that you could set up on the platform, which are similar to official company pages on Facebook. And as for Kakao, it has 170 million users and is the national messenger in South Korea. One of the most beloved things about Kakao are the cute and expressive stickers that they have. Kakao also has a mobile payment function, and they have this interesting secret chat function that will only keep conversations for up to 3 days, and an in-chat search function that allows users to search things up on the web without having to leave the app. And like WeChat, Kakao also has official accounts and business channels that companies can create. Because there wasn't a whole lot of literature on the topic, I did a media scan to see if people were talking about these apps in mainstream Canadian media. I basically tried to look for articles about Facebook, WeChat, and Kakao. I picked Facebook as a proxy for mainstream Canadian social media because it's such a popular platform over here. I used Google News and entered search terms such as policy or Facebook and saw what results came out. I looked at 4 outlets in total: Globe and Mail, National Post, Toronto Star, and Vancouver Sun. I picked the Globe and Mail and National Post because they are the top online news outlets in Canada. Then I looked at the Star and the Sun because, as I mentioned before, Toronto and Vancouver have the highest concentration of Chinese Canadians and Korean Canadians. I then pulled out all the articles from the top searches onto a gigantic, messy spreadsheet. You can see a portion of that in the screenshot over here. And then after pulling out that data, I did some basic analysis of the articles. For the sake of time, I'll just go over a portion of my findings. So for one scan, I pulled 101 articles with the search terms policy and Facebook. And note that I actually had to cap the number of Facebook articles I pulled because there were so many of them. So with the exception of the National Post, I only took the first 30 articles that came up. So the collection of Facebook articles I took was only a sample. On the other hand, for WeChat, I didn't have to cap the number at all because there weren't a whole lot of them. In total, I pulled 30 WeChat articles. What is striking to me was that there were no articles on Kakao, not even a single one, to my dismay. And I think this might be because there hasn't been any sort of scandal or huge news involving Kakao in the Western sphere lately. There was one with WeChat when Trump wanted to ban it and TikTok. And this is significant to me because it could suggest that no one pays attention to these apps and something big really happens. I'm not sure that is necessarily a good thing. So the following findings are really just a comparison between Facebook and WeChat. So one of the things I did was to label the articles by relevance to see if the article was actually talking about the app in a way that goes beyond introducing its functions or talking about policy. So let me show you an example here on the screen. These are two articles that pop up when I use the search terms policy and Facebook. And what Google News does is that it returns articles with either or search terms. So the article on the left, WhatsApp has until the end of February to clarify changes to its privacy policy, EU says. I would label as relevant because it talks about Facebook and WhatsApp and the topic is tied to some policy. On the other hand, the article on the right about vaccine mandates, I labeled as irrelevant. The article popped up because the word policy was in the article, but as much as vaccine mandates are an important topic, they aren't useful for my research. And in general, I was quite conservative and only weeded out the most irrelevant articles. After that, here is a word cloud comparison of the topics that surround Facebook articles in blue and topics that surround WeChat articles in green. We can see that the topics surrounding Facebook are generally a lot more diverse. I had a suspicion that many of the WeChat articles were less about policy and more about politics in China. And judging from the word cloud, it seems that it might be true. Notice that the WeChat topics are also a lot less solutions-based. For example, for Facebook, they talked about things like content moderation, regulations, bills, privacy, etc. These words don't really appear in the WeChat word cloud, and the word cloud is rather politically charged without a whole lot of discussion on solutions or other aspects of the app aside from censorship and disinformation. And the only reason election was such a large word in the word cloud was because a conservative candidate said something that upset Chinese Canadians during the election. So as you can see, it also really wasn't about WeChat in and of itself. And while politics is important, I do think that people are overlooking other aspects of the digital space. So what are my recommendations? First, I recommend that the provincial and or municipal governments work together with partners to investigate these apps and the users of these apps. They could form a working group that could conduct research and produce a report or another deliverable, like a video series on ethnic-centric apps in their region. This is a really good chance to actually understand and listen to people in the community whose voices may not always be heard in our Anglo-centric or Franco-centric mainstream world. In the future, the research from this report could not only provide information on the digital sphere, but also the general social sphere of migrants. The project should last under a year. My second recommendation is to include and incorporate a discussion of digital diasporas and ethnic-centric apps in media studies and journalism. This recommendation is aimed at educational institutions. If a student is learning about the Canadian media landscape, it is important that ethnic minorities and their digital livelihood is touched upon in their courses. My third recommendation is to diversify the news content on these ethnic-centric apps. Since there is evidence that suggests that news content on WeChat and Kakao can come from secondhand, sometimes inaccurately translated mainstream Canadian content, this skew is not good for democracy nor for digital inclusion aspects, because it elevates the risk of news being too one-sided or potentially isolating users from feeling like the news is actually relevant to their way of life. The news space on these apps could easily become digital echo chambers of the same content over and over. Thus, it is important to revamp and rethink the news space of these apps. One scholar brought up the possibility of needing non-English mainstream social media news and Canadian sources, which would help diasporic groups access more accurate information firsthand. Reporters who are able to access the apps should consider publishing their content on the apps. Having trained journalists and reporters publish their findings on the app could bring the news content to another level of diversity and accuracy. Fourth, for organizations and government bodies who may want to address or target a specific group, they should take advantage of these ethnic-centric apps as a channel to reach these groups. So for example, government departments and institutions that work with immigration, citizenship, or compensation for historical mistakes, such as the Japanese internments or the Komagata Maru incident, Chinese head tax, truth and reconciliation for First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and supporting oppressed Black Canadians, etc., would benefit from using these type of apps. They could create official accounts and public accounts to gain subscribers and help spread news or advance social initiatives and civic action. These apps could actually also help with organizing collective action and community outreach, as the Chinese community did in Australia to support Black Lives Matter. And finally, as a precaution, the federal government should be careful not to conflate all social media apps as big tech platforms that need to be managed. So although WeChat and Kakao, for example, are products of big tech companies, policymakers should be careful not to lump them together with mainstream Canadian social media apps. if regulation is to be implemented. There are many aspects to reigning in big tech and influential social media apps, including competition, market power concerns, online harm, content moderation, cybersecurity, jurisdictional tensions, privacy, you name it. Some aspects of big tech regulation may be more relevant to ethnic-centric apps, such as content moderation. As mentioned before, research has shown that news content of these apps could be skewed due to mistranslation or untrained reporting. However, other aspects may be less so, such as competition. There is currently little evidence of a threat of these platforms taking over or abusing their monopolistic powers, at least not in Canada. In addition, regulating ethnic-centric apps require an extra layer of thought, as there is potential digital exclusion or discrimination problem due to just how ethnically concentrated the users are. So for example, regardless of potential future political tensions of the home countries of these apps, policymakers should think twice before imposing a ban on these apps, because that in itself is an act of digital discrimination, adding volume to historical oppression. So finally, overall, the general recommendation is very simple. We just need to learn more about these apps and the users who use them. These apps are an untapped reservoir, especially for a country like Canada, who brands itself as multicultural. Private companies and influencers have already started to tap into this resource. For example, TELUS partnered with WeChat to create SIM cards. So again, it seems like the private sector is quicker to see the potential of various digital initiatives than the other sectors. So hopefully more people in the public sectors and influential institutions and educational institutions will start to learn about ethnic-centric apps soon. The image here are characters from Kakao, by the way, just because the app needed more exposure. Thank you very much, and I welcome any questions and feedback.